So let's continue working on this palette component. So in the last video, I said that all we needed to make a component was to have a function that returns some JSX. That was actually a lie, because we need to have some way for our component to accept input. Like if I go to my canvas here, I can drag out a bunch of these palettes onto the screen like I've done, but they all end up looking exactly the same. What if I want to have one that has a red title bar instead of this light blue? Or maybe I want it to look exactly the same, but I want it to be a slightly different size. I don't want to have to rebuild a completely new component every time I want to make a subtle variation in this one that I've already built. I should be able to use what I've already built and just pass in some data to the component, like say a title bar color or a width and a height, and have the component adjust itself to match those variables. So I want to make this component accept some data. Well, my component is just a function, and we already know that functions can accept data by adding arguments to these parentheses. So to actually make this a true React component, we need to add just a single argument here, and we're going to call it props, which is short for properties. Now remember, with a function, I get to make up the name of this argument. So I could call this anything I want, but in React components, the convention is to always call this props. And also React components always only have this one argument. But how does that work? I said we'd be able to set the width and the height, but how can I send this function those 2 bits of data if I can only have one argument? The answer is all the data I need for this component will come in as part of this one argument, because this props argument is an object. So this props object can have many keys and values that correspond to all the data I want to send into this component. So if you want to imagine the structure of this props object getting passed in, it might look something like this, just an object with keys and values. And I can access any one of these values by using the dot syntax that we looked at earlier. So props.width or props.height or props.titleBarColor. But where does this come from? How do I actually send props to my component? Well, in Framer, we actually have a few different ways that props can get set. The first way is just from the Framer canvas. So if I switch over to the canvas and look at one of my component instances, I can see this purple box that's part of the component. And this box is actually setting the width and the height props for my component. By default, it's 200 by 200, but I can resize this box to be any size I want, and it will update the props values in my component. But you might notice that nothing is actually happening when I resize this purple box. Why is that? This box is sending the width and the height to my component as part of the props object. And back in my code, my component is accepting this props object. So I have access to those width and height values that are getting sent, but I'm just not actually doing anything with them. They come into my component through this props object, but then I never actually use them in my JSX, which is the part of my component that actually creates elements on the screen. So if I look at my JSX, I actually have a spot right here where I'm setting the width and the height of my palette. So instead of having these hard-coded numbers here for these values, I can just change these to specify that the width should be equal to props.width, and the height should be equal to props.height. Now my width and height will be set to whatever values are coming in through props. So if I go back to my canvas, now we can see that the size of my component, the size of that frame that's getting output by my JSX, is actually getting set by the size of this purple bounding box. Now, what if I want to make this title bar color customizable too? Well, again, I just need to add a place in my JSX where I set the color to use props instead of using any explicit value or instead of using the default value. Now, this name, title bar color, is something that I'm making up. So width and height are properties that are intrinsic to a frame, but title bar color is totally custom for my component. So I could call this whatever I want. I just need to make sure that the name that I'm using when I'm setting this prop from outside the component matches the name that I'm using inside my component. But how would I set this prop from outside the component? There's no way for me to set a title bar color from the canvas like I did with width and height. So one way to set that would be using overrides. So I'm going to select one of the palettes on my canvas, and then I'm just going to choose this default examples file that Framer generates for me. And if I switch over to that examples file, we can see some of the examples that Framer gives us for overrides. So the structure of these should look pretty familiar. Each one is a function that returns an object, and each object has one or more named properties inside it. So you might have already played around with overrides a bit in your prototypes. What you might not have realized is that this object that gets returned from an override function is the props object that gets passed to our component. So, for example, this override that makes things draggable is just returning a props object with a single property called drag set to true. And so if I want to create my own custom override to control the title bar color of my palette, I just need to create an override function that returns an object with a custom value for my title bar color property. In this case, I'm going to set it to this gray value. So now I can go back to my canvas and I can select that gray title bar override for my palette component, and it will send that custom prop to my component. Now the catch with overrides is I will only see that change when I run it in the Framer preview. I don't see any changes from the overrides to the component on the canvas. But now that I have that override set up, I can add any other properties I want to get sent through this props object to my component. So I could add a rotation and a border. But the catch is, remember, this is sending those values into my component via the props object. But if I want them to have an effect on how my component appears on the screen, I need to make sure to apply these new props to my JSX in my component. So I can just add them to the main frame. Again, setting each one equal to whatever value is coming in through the props object. Now it does seem like a pain to have to do this for every property that I might want to alter through an override. So we'll learn how to get around that in the next video. But just to recap what we learned in this video, our component can accept data through the props object. And in Framer, there are multiple ways to set these props. And in fact, we're going to learn about a couple more in the next video.